Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Sivanand.
If we're not focused on the outcome, then the actions will never deliver value. This is the thing that frustrates me. So much work is done that delivers zero value. Outrageous amounts of work is done in this world that delivers zero value.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. On this episode, we get to hear Janice Fraser. Now, if you've participated in a workshop that was facilitated by myself or one of the folks from Integral, chances are that a lot of the techniques that we use stem from Janice's work. I've gotten to personally learn a ton from Janice around lean product management, facilitative leadership, and all around just being a better human being. I got to work with Janice at Pivotal, and she has also worked at Netscape as a designer and product manager in the mid-90s, right after their IPO. She was a founding partner at Adaptive Path that got acquired by Capital One. And she is an advisor to numerous companies, including TaskRabbit, Product Table, and Procter Gamble, where we get to hear a few stories from during the episode. Janice has worked with hundreds of startups and helped them identify lean experiments, and more importantly, do so in a hyper-collaborative, customer-centric, data-oriented manner, using really fantastic facilitation techniques. Now, I'll admit, when I was first taught these techniques, I thought it was a little bit of hype and just a bunch of sticky notes, but thankfully I quickly realized how powerful they are and how much of an effective way they are to drive durable decisions. Her methods have been used numerous times at Integral, internally, with our clients, and even for myself personally, when I need help in getting my thoughts organized and prioritizing my actions, almost like a micro-journaling and prioritization framework. On this episode, we get to talk about the book that she co-wrote with Jason, her husband, Farther, Faster, Way Less Drama, with the foreword written by Eric Ries, the author of Lean Startup. We talk about things like the concept of forces of friction that impede innovation and change, and how some of that friction is actually good, while others, of course, isn't as much, and how to discern between them. We get into the importance of gaining truth and insights in data from multiple lenses in an organization, and how the key leadership motion is really to facilitate information across your people. It was really fun for me to hear Janice's stories as she guides us through some of the thinking and facilitating frameworks that reduce stress and help us make extraordinary progress as leaders. One note is that we had a bit of a technical issue with my microphone about halfway through. My team did our best to clean it up, but some of y'all may notice a little bit of reduced audio quality on my end. The good news is we get to hear Janice fine and clear and all of her insights nevertheless. And I trust that you will have as much fun listening as I did recording with Janice. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Janice, welcome to the show. I've really been looking forward to having you on here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to it as well.
So you and I have gotten to work together in the past, so I know a little bit more about your background, but for the audience, maybe give us a little bit of a primer of how you've arrived at where you
Well, so for about 20 years, I was an entrepreneur. I started 6 companies, and you don't do that if you are a billionaire. You kind of stop. And so I kept going, because I had to. I loved being an entrepreneur, but at a certain point, I landed at Pivotal, which is where you and I met. And I guess we probably met before that, but Pivotal was a really marvelous place, and through that experience, I ended up moving away from software and toward kind of landing all the innovation and entrepreneurship lessons in a larger context. So I've spent the past probably decade working on very large organizations and helping them to embrace lean, agile, innovation type processes. And, that has led to all sorts of interestingness because, now instead of just doing Silicon Valley style entrepreneurship, I'm looking at, how do you innovate a bottle of shampoo? And I work with a company that's doing a space plane. So like really radically outside of what I had experienced previously.
Yeah. And I think when you think about software and innovation, there's like this correlation that folks have, but they can also be mutually exclusive, of course, where you can like shampoo bottles can have innovation without software. And Lord knows you and I have worked around folks that built software without necessarily much innovation. So how did that, how did you kind of detach those two and go down the innovation path versus going deeper on the software side?
I'm really motivated to understand human behavior, like how do humans become more efficient and effective, and how do we just make better decisions collectively? And I got a lot of that. I really feel like working in software, particularly working in the kind of software that we did at Pivotal, was extreme programming. It's this like immersively collaborative experience. And when we went to Pivotal, we brought along with us this idea of balanced team. And so now instead of just intensely collaborative software developers at, terminals, it's also deeply collaborative cross-functionally. And that unit, what we called there a balanced team, that unit of the cross-functional people who had the necessary inputs to create an outcome, that became a transportable idea. And so how do you deeply collaboratively move very quickly across what could easily be silos, and most organizations are functional silos. And so that unit of effectiveness became my focal point. That became the thing that I was interested in exploring kind of across wherever it could take me. And I had the opportunity to start working with companies like Nike and Procter Gamble, and that led to a whole lot of other things as well. And when you think about where do we need innovation the most as a planet, we kind of need to stop shipping plastic bottles of liquid, all over the place and then dumping them in the ocean. Like we really, really need all of those older industries to do something very radically different than what they've been doing. And so that's been a really fruitful place for me to work.
So what can we look forward to with respect to innovations around bottles and detergent as consumers?
Yeah. Oh, I'm really excited about this. So it has taken a long time for them to be able to do this, but Procter & Gamble is test marketing a waterless, plasticless form factor for Tide detergent. And, Tide is one of the biggest laundry detergents on the planet. And personally, if I could get Tide to stop shipping water, that would be amazing. It would be so good for the planet. And like I said, it's taken a long time, took a lot of organizational transformation for them to be able to take this very disruptive kind of technology for them and land it in their kind of primary brand platform. It's super exciting, and it's going to do really good things for the planet. So look for that Tide Evo, EVO. It'll probably be available in a year-ish, maybe two, but it's currently in test market. Yeah.
Awesome. In Colorado, is it that it's in test?
Yeah. They announced it publicly at South by Southwest, which is why I can talk about it.
Let's go a little bit deeper there with laundry sheets. It's not something invented necessarily at Procter & Gamble, as we've seen laundry sheets around. Sure. And Procter & Gamble, of course, got decades worth of consumer insights and a lot of investment that goes into R&D, as well as a huge distribution channel. Like if Procter & Gamble is going to solve or have an impact on shipping and carbon footprint a lot more than the smaller companies that you can go to the store and buy laundry sheets from today. Maybe not even necessarily about Procter and Gamble, but when you think about big companies that have all of that legacy, you can call it asset. At the same time, there's also some kind of debt that they carry because they didn't come up with the dryer sheets, right? What is something that you see as a trend across the enterprises that leads to that?
So there are headwinds and there are tailwinds, right? For both of these. For when you're talking about any extremely large organization, there are very strong, very important forces preventing change. And there are very strong, very important forces demanding change. And both of those come internally and externally. And so so this is why it's such a fascinating challenge. Like, how do you actually affect change in these like super high leverage environments? Because you have to acknowledge what's preventing us from changing internally, what's preventing us from changing externally, and how can we separate the good reasons that were blocked from the bad reasons that were blocked, and how can we work kind of with them. But as long as you're kind of working under the assumption that, change is great, all change is great, and they have to change, and if they don't change, then they're bad, like you're just never going to get anything done. So I have I have a friend, her name is Hannah Jones, and she's one of the folks that we interviewed for the book. I worked with her at Nike. She was the chief sustainability officer at Nike for like 15, 16 years. And then she became head of innovation, president of something they called Valiant Labs, which was their kind of disruptive innovation center. And, Hannah was brought in at a time when Nike was taking a lot of heat for the labor practices in their supply chains. So we're going back in time now, maybe 20 years. And, and I asked Hannah, how did you go into, I know Hannah really well. She's like this like super good human. And how do you go into a supply chain where labor is being extremely exploited, to the extent that there were accusations of enslavement? And, how do you go in there and work with those supply chain owners to make change happen when really like we morally find them contemptible? And she's like, well, you have to let them be the hero of their own story. So there's this sense of really sitting with what is true and figuring out how to transform that into something good. And that really forms one of the core principles that caused us to write the book is this, like, we're all taught all these ways to set goals. Like, we can envision a world as we wish it would be. But we're really not taught, and you can do like OGSMs, OKRs, like all these different modalities for goal setting. And goaling is really, really important. But we've never been taught how to notice what's true right now and how to align on that, right? And, what's true right now is everything, right? If I say like, okay, I need my team to get from Denver to Albuquerque. If half of my team is in Miami on vacation and I give them driving directions from Denver to Albuquerque, it's not going to do them any good. We have to know where we are, and we have to all acknowledge where we are in order for us to get someplace else collectively. So, yeah, so that's some of the stuff that I think about in these big transformations.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, in terms of the introspection and understanding the friction points around what is it that's blocking us from change. And some of those reasons are good because it maybe protects the business and other things like that. And other ones are bad.
Yeah. I mean, it can be protecting any number of things, right?
Sure. Yeah. The environment, the site, totally.
Yeah.
So what are some examples?
Human practices? Yeah, sure.
So what are some examples that come to mind for our audience in terms of helping them delineate between good versus bad reasons for inhibiting change?
So the question then is, how do you discern what's effective and productive from what's not? Sometimes it's So there are two kinds of, I'm going to stop short of saying good and bad. It's what's changeable and what's not changeable, or what would have to become true in order for us to be able to change something that we wish to change. But it all starts with knowing that path from point A to point B, right? So if you say, here's where we are right now. So the model we use is SCQA. This is Barbara Minto. She developed this back in the 60s. Situation, complication, question, answer. So she created the communications protocol that's used by McKinsey even today, right? So if you say, well, what is the current situation? The current, let's have a hypothetical. We were just talking about Tide laundry detergent. The situation is that we know that plastic use is a problem. We know that we need to reduce carbon emissions. There are these ESG guidelines. Every company on the planet has a 2030 carbon reduction goal and a 2040 carbon reduction goal. Okay, so that's the current context, right? But that's not the whole situation, because there's a complication there. The complication is that companies like Procter Gamble, every company that's publicly traded, is beholden to a board of directors, who's beholden to the analyst phone calls every quarter, who are beholden in turn to the shareholders. So there's this immense quarterly pressure to maintain current amount of sales, right? To grow sales quarter over quarter, year over year, to increase not only top line, but to maintain a strong bottom line, right? So there are all these externalities that are forcing companies like Procter and Gamble to take up a certain amount of shelf space at the Target, at the Walmart. And how do you take up that much shelf space if suddenly the form factor of your product is tiny? Right? It tanks your sales. Okay. So now there are good reasons to maintain a certain amount of linear feet in the laundry detergent aisle. So now you have these countervailing forces, and you have to figure out what would need to be true in order for us to go to market with a smaller package. Right. So so the situation, complication, question, answer is like, the complication is that we have two competing external forces at the same time demanding different movements from us. And so that's just true. So then you can ask the question and devise an answer. And the question is, how might we meet both of these apparently conflicting goals of, changing our formulation and package in order to meet our ESG goals, compared to maintaining our prominence on store shelves in order to meet our sales, our consumers' sales throughput, right? And there's when you really get to this level, there's no good answer, but you can't come to an answer unless you have a good formulation of the question. So that's what we really focus on, is what is a good formulation of the question? And once you have smart people focused on the right question, then you can begin to devise answers. And I can't speak to what, we're now in very theoretical P&G imagination land. So I don't know what they're doing to reconcile those two things, but that's how I go about the process.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
Let's go back to something else you mentioned around point A and point B. And I've been super lucky that I got to be trained personally by you on a lot of the facilitation techniques. And point A to point B is a term that I had used a lot previously. And I thought, okay, I'm going to skip over this chapter of this and kind of zone out a little bit and realize that there's so much more than I had thought about really getting into the depth of both point A, where we are, and then point B, where we want to get to. So maybe let's hear your version of how to be maybe rigorous or disciplined or things to think about when you're defining each of them.
So point A, we've touched on. I really think about this situation complication component, and when I think about what is the situation, that's usually the easiest part. But if I tell the situation myself, I'm going to get one version of it. But if I ask three other people, what is your version of the situation? Okay, now we have a really rich picture, because it's inevitably that you or they see the situation slightly differently. And this is where having a diverse team helps. And I mean functionally diverse, any dimension of diversity. I happen to believe in, diversity and inclusion as a business success strategy. But if you get people from different points of view, simply stating their version of current state, you will have a much richer, much more diverse picture, a much clearer picture of what is actually true, because you're looking at the problem from multiple sides. Now, then you do the same thing with complication. And especially if you're working from a functional diverse team perspective, you're going to get a very different set of circumstances than if you just think of it yourself. This is where I for a while I was calling the whole book, I was calling it facilitative leadership, because the leadership motion that's most important is facilitating other people sharing information, right? So if the prompt is, what's making this hard? What makes it difficult to move forward on whatever this initiative is? You're going to get, and you have a cross-functional team, you're going to get that cross-functional viewpoint. Now you're equipped with a much richer understanding of the challenge in front of you. And, there are two ways to get that data. Number one, you ask for it up front and you get a rich picture up front, and you start to strategize around how we might move forward despite all of that. Number two, you get stuck somewhere in the execution phase and you get frustrated and people get mad at each other, or, and then you have to do a big fact finding, uncover, like, why are we blocked? So if we just take even an hour, half an hour to evaluate from multiple points of view, what is the situation? What's the complication? We're going to be able to create a better strategy for enacting whatever the objective is, the motion.
Mm-hmm. And then how about on the point B? Any tips on clarifying the vision or the destination?
We tend to plan point B as a result, like an output, right? At the end of this, we will have a report. At the end of this, we will have a something. And I think of that as a very fragile way to organize a plan. It's much more effective if you organize a plan around outcomes. Like, what is the result? If we were to do these things, if we were to create this, whatever the noun is, this output, what will now be true? And the analogy that I use is like, if I'm on San Francisco Bay and I'm sailing a boat, I can say, I want to get to Berkeley, and I can sail my boat from San Francisco to Berkeley. It's not going to be a straight path because, the wind changes and something, another boat comes out from under the bridge or whatever, right? So our plan, the way that we normally plan is like we say, I'm going to get in my boat, I'm going to sail straight ahead, I'm going to turn left, and then I'm going to sail straight ahead again, and then I'm going to turn right, and I'm going to be there. Like, we make this plan as if we can anticipate exactly what's happening. But, the world is dynamic right now. I mean, crazy stuff is happening every day. So you just never know. So having a plan that is organized around outcomes is much more durable and resilient, and it allows for just-in-time planning of the different activities. So it releases just some of the pressure to execute on the plan exactly as you wrote it in the first place, as if you had a crystal ball and could imagine a perfectly executed plan.
And then likely also want to hear about how this might unlock the potential of your team by clarifying that outcome versus I've worked at and helped a lot of companies that are really good at clarifying the plan and sometimes don't even talk about the outcome. And when we get in there to facilitate and we ask them the outcome, they have to go find out what it's all going to do. Or maybe they have a sense and they don't have specifics, right? So I think there's maybe an element to unlocking team potential too. What do you think?
Absolutely. Well, it creates space for people to use their own judgment and their own insights to make micro adjustments as you go. So if you write out, if some project manager writes out a stepwise plan, and, I've seen the Gantt charts, hundreds and hundreds of lines, right? 18, 19, 20, 35 months in advance, right? You've got these like multi-year plans with hundreds of line items. How can you possibly know that that is exactly how it's going to play out? And so what happens is a plan like that suggests that individuals should not think for themselves about how best to move forward. So if instead what you do is sequence, and we create really deep sequences of incremental outcomes, right? If you create sequences of outcomes, you free up some of those line items for people to notice what's true, notice what's happening and unfolding in real time, make small adjustments, and not even have to talk to each other about those small adjustments, because the right outcome, everyone is counting on the result rather than counting on the specific action.
And one of the challenges with outcomes is, compared to outputs, is that outcomes can arguably be harder to measure versus outputs, especially at a big company that's used to having 3 decimal points of data all the time, is going to maybe feel uncomfortable with outcomes that maybe have plus or minus 20% margin of error, or maybe describe more qualitatively than quantitatively, right? So what's your advice there?
The advice is that I don't know, it depends. And that is certainly a hard piece of work. It's much easier to hold somebody accountable for delivering an inch of paper. Here's my report on XYZ. So I think of, I'm going to pick on McKinsey Consulting for a minute here. So McKinsey is notorious for delivering an inch of paper and not delivering a result, right? They deliver a theoretical result, not an actual result, not an outcome. So, the answer is that it requires an understanding and an explicit agreement on the part of all the levels of leadership that this is how we want to work. And sometimes an outcome is measurable. An outcome can be, I need 10x growth. I need 1x growth. I need whatever growth. That is both an output and an outcome. So I'm not a purist. Sometimes in the precision that is required of software product managers, we can get very, very precise about the difference between an outcome and an output. I am not in that camp. I believe that when we're defining our outcomes, we want to be able to look at that outcome and ask ourselves, if we accomplish that, will we have arrived at an important place that represents progress? If the answer is yes, then that's good enough for me. What is the important place is the first question. And the second question is, how will we know if we get there? And, and we just have to have agreement as leaders that that's okay. That's okay. And ultimately, in these very large companies, especially publicly traded companies, ultimately, there's often a metric at the top that we're rolling up to. But how we get to the metric, the strategies that we employ to get to that metric often do not have quite such precisely measurable results, outcomes.
Do you find that there is a trend in the talent base that, or in the leadership talent, or on the folks who are closer to the product that tend to fit in better with this? Or is there a cultural element? If I was a leader of the organization wanting to drive a change towards this, what's the people aspect that comes to mind from your experience?
Boy, this is a tough one because there are certain mechanics that make it really difficult to adapt our people systems, or especially our people management systems. I believe that there are a number of trends that are encouraging people, leaders specifically, to think in this direction. Agile is kind of what we would say, the lowercase a, agile management, agile leadership has been a trend. I think any embrace of disruptive innovation will force you toward these directions. But at the same time, often talent management systems are very much about excellence within function, and people are often measured against one another. So if you say, I'm going to create a set of outcomes, and we're going to cross-functionally team around these, accomplishing these outcomes, you've now organized in such a way that you're in conflict with your talent management mechanisms, right? Your talent development mechanisms, right? So if I get promoted because I'm part of a marketing function, but my teammates are not marketing people, then the marketing function doesn't actually know how well I'm doing, right? And if people on every team are forced ranked and the bottom gets dinged, then we've got 3, 6, 9 people on a team, and 3 of them are going to get crappy reviews. Like it literally breaks the mechanisms that we have institutionalized in many of our largest organizations.
Like we talked about, the complexity of outcome measurement trickles down into complexity of performance measurement against that outcome as a subset, right? One of my favorite things in basketball is, sure, we've got points and rebounds and all the things that you would usually see on like your, rookie cards. And there's another stat that is measured called a plus minus, where when that player is on the floor of the 5 players, what is this? Like, is the score generally higher or lower? And they may not add to points or rebounds or assists directly, but there is a stat that says, we don't know why, maybe from this one stat, but the team's usually 10 points ahead when this person's on the floor.
For sure. I love this. I love this concept. I wish that we had a universal name for it. And so I have 2 stories about this. There was this guy, his name was Aaron. He was a designer at Pivotal. And when there were new pivots, so working at Pivotal, for those who aren't familiar, working at Pivotal was a very specific kind of culture, right? There was a certain amount of emotional intelligence that was required. And we just had a way of working that was really unique. And it usually took a few months, 2-3 months, for people to sort of detox from their previous work experience and to just kind of settle into the deeply empathetic workplace that we had. When Aaron was on a team, new hire pivots, within a month, they were completely onboarded and working seamlessly. Nobody knew how he did it. But we all knew if we had to get a new pivot up and running really quickly, you team him with Aaron. You just, doesn't matter what role they are, you just put them on the same team as Aaron, and they would come up to speed really quickly. Super magic. It was a magic. It made people productive like in a third the time. There's another story. A young woman was kind of worked her way through college, working at Victoria's Secret, and she was the category manager for the bra category. She worked at a flagship store in San Jose. And when she was there organizing bras, like big deal, right? Whatever. And when she worked, that store would do $6,000 more business. Not because of how she sold, but because of how she managed the team, how she organized the store shelves, like whatever it was that she was doing, sales increased routinely by about $6,000 every time she worked.
let's kind of go a little bit further into the hypothetical here with either of these two folks, right? Because what I would imagine would be done is if the company's trying to optimize for onboarding, they'd look at Aaron and say, hey, there's something that Aaron's is doing that's different. Let's go do in the day in the life study or something like that to understand what's Aaron doing differently. And they'll come up with what they think is the reasons, but really are probably closer to assumptions or hypotheses. And then tell all the other designers or team leads to say, hey, going forth, you must do these things as a checklist. Tell me if you're doing them or not. And sometimes forget to say, hey, what we want to do is optimize for bra sales, or we want to optimize for having the lowest onboarding time. And there's some benefit in studying what makes Aaron successful. And there's also some pitfalls. And so help me navigate through
well, that's not what they did.
When not do.
Yeah, there are two things that they did. Yeah, two things that they did. I feel like you need to say this. These are the mistakes that they made. They made Aaron a manager. Aaron was not a great manager. Aaron didn't want to be a manager. It was too stressful for him. And part of what made him so good is that he was really empathetic and he was very kind to the people, right? So he just was a great individual contributor. So that was the first thing. The second thing was somehow make Aaron in charge of the onboarding process. Also, not at all what he was good at. And so eventually we all figured it out, and Aaron just went back to being the person that they would pair you with if you were new. But it would have been much better to go examine day in the life. What is it that he does? And how is that different from what other people do? And yeah, but that wasn't your question. So what was the question again?
Yeah, I mean, let's carry on, right? Like in that hypothetical where we said what would have been better if they did the day in the life of Aaron. And I think the concern or the question comes up for me around, okay, this is something that's specific to Aaron and may or may not apply to everybody else. And say we come up with onboarding guidelines for the other folks that are pairing in with the new hires. We could give them a list of things Aaron does and have them optimize for that. And that's starting, my gut tells me that's a little bit more on the output side versus saying something like, hey, we really need to onboard folks quickly. Help us out with that. This is maybe something that works. And that's my best guess. So I'm curious to know what you might do with that information later to do the outputs versus outcomes thing.
Yeah. This is really interesting. So the outcome is that being on a team with this individual means that people get it faster. So if that's the outcome that we want to replicate, I would look for, what are the things about Aaron that I would come up with hypotheses. What are some things about Aaron that are making it possible for that person to come up to speed? And then I would see if I could find other people who exhibit the same characteristics. Rather than trying to have a checklist or whatever, do this, do that, do the other thing. It's like, there's this really ambiguous outcome. The ambiguous outcome is ready faster. And probably the inputs that are creating that outcome, ready faster, probably the inputs are something about emotional intelligence and kindness and articulate about describing their craft and willing to take time to explain the whole organization, that kind of thing. Like, okay, these are things that this person does naturally. Let's see if we can find 5 other people. Okay, now maybe we can say, well, let's do a buddy system. Let's just have people who are natural onboarders, right? And let's keep an eye out now for the profile of person who's able to welcome people in a really effective, on-target kind of way. So it's like, if you value the outcome, then you can actually come up with 3 or 4 different experiments, right? That say, well, what if we make him a manager? Nope, that didn't work. What if we make him in charge of training? Nope, that's not it. What if we, right? So by valuing the outcome, we give ourselves permission to make a flawed plan, notice that the plan is flawed, try again.
That way, yeah, folks have the context to iterate their way towards why we're doing all of this in the first place, and also some level of coaching and context. And hey, this is what's worked for everyone else. And I like the behavioral aspect, because I think we forget about that in terms of, it's not what is Aaron doing, it's what is it about Aaron and how they show up and their values or their behavior. And
the thing that I think is really notable about this from an outcome output standpoint is outcomes, outputs, and activities are kind of the three ways that we talk about this. There's a thing you could do, right? There's the result of work done, the tangible outcome or output from work done. And then there's the outcome. And in this case, the actions would be, what is Aaron doing? The thing is, we don't know what Aaron's doing. So we could make a plan around those actions and the plan could not deliver the outcome, right? The plan was, let's make him a manager. Let's make him in charge of training. Let's make him do, we can come up with these actions, but if we're not focused on the outcome, then the actions will never deliver value. This is the thing that frustrates me. So much work is done that delivers zero value. Outrageous amounts of work is done in this world that delivers zero value. I heard a statistic, and I've heard it repeated about once a decade for the last 30 years, that 85% of IT investments never see the light of day. So that's all this work time. That's a lot of work time. Even if that number is inflated, is double what it is. That's still an outrageous amount of waste in the system at a time when our planet cannot handle waste. We need to be much more effective.
Yeah, you just gave me some bitter memories that led to my switching away from software engineering into product management. I happen to work at an IoT manufacturing company, so I had to read the goal, not by Eli Goldratt, but Theory of Constraints, not for optimizing my software team, but to understand my customers better. And I was chipping away, writing a bunch of code, only to find out later that no one clicked the button. And no one seemed to, this is early in my career where I was still just kind of asking all the, call it, dumb questions. And when we realized that no one cared about it, I felt like I was the only one who took it personally. I spent months of my life putting into this, and everyone seemed like it was going to be the best idea ever. And realized that there might be a little bit more solve to it. I didn't really know the answer to what that solve was until I came to Pivotal. And so it was this magical place that had already written the book that I was wondering if it exists. And so you just reminded me a lot of that. Going back to the aspects of the book, you talk about, the 4 leadership motions.
We didn't go into the book writing process knowing that we had 4 motions. It was writing the book. So we worked on this book for 4 years, right? Start to finish, 4 years. And it went through 2 major complete reorganizations. Because what we found is that we started with a very tactical book, but we kept asking why. Why does this matter? What is the next? What is really that we're trying to accomplish? And that led to the title Farther, Faster, and Far Less Drama. We want to go to ambitious places with less fuss, right? Because of all the urgency that we see in the world. And halfway through writing the book, the pandemic happened, and, George Floyd was murdered, and all of that stuff, right? Created this sense of really there's something greater that we want to describe here. And so we summarize them as these 4 things that leaders can do, which is why we call them motions. So really as a leader, what can we do? And the first thing is orient honestly. And that's this point A, point B thing. Yes, we can set goals, but we have to know where we are right now. And we have to know why is it complicated to move forward? So orient honestly is number 1. Let's get out our compass, metaphorically speaking, figure out where the heck we are. The second is value outcomes. And we've talked about that a bit already, but really the reason that outcome-based planning is so much more important now is that the world is outrageously dynamic. Whether it's extreme weather or political complications and unrest or mass shootings down the street or stock market volatility or AI gets released, you name it, we're dealing with surprises constantly. And so traditional planning is beginning to really be less and less effective for many kinds of work. And the solution there is to make your plans around results, around outcomes. What is the outcome you wish to have? And what we found, both through research and through our own lived experience, is that when you organize your plans around outcomes, it is much more easy, much simpler to allow the detailed planning to be dynamic and responsive to unfolding circumstance. So valuing outcomes is a way to stay sane, to reduce that dramatic overhead of that replanning requires. So the third, I've alluded to, but I've not named yet, is leverage the brains. Like that cross-functional teaming that allows you to see a problem from many sides. Like really the role of leadership is to frame the problem to be solved and then engage the right minds to creatively, dynamically solve for that problem, to move into that desired outcome space. So it's this leverage the brains is about engaging, moving away from language like stakeholders and buy-in, right? What's the more sophisticated, deeper version of that? It's not just that you have a stake in it, it's that there's a very specific kind of involvement that would be valuable. And maybe that involvement is about helping to make a decision. We used to say when we were working at Pivotal, I need to make a decision as a service to the team, because without a decision, we can't move forward. So I don't make it as a product manager. I don't always make decisions because I own the decision and I'm a mini CEO and I'm going to have my little say and I'm going to make that decision because I have been imbued with authority. It's a different framing. I make a decision as a service to the team so that we can make progress together. Totally different framing. And so what we want is to involve people who can help us make wise decisions, who have the subject matter expertise, people who have to live with the results of our decision. So those are the kinds of people that we want to involve. And we want to involve those people in a way that is situationally appropriate. So leveraging the brains is a lot about extracting information, extracting perspectives, engaging in micro decision making so that we can come to a really strong analysis and a deeply aligned plan, a decision for going forward. So leveraging the brains, super important. And then the final is to make durable decisions. And I think this is one of the places that people really get tripped up. I think I've been thinking about decision making kind of as a science and as a practice for decades now. And in what I've seen is that there are two ways that decision making really trips up organizations. One is that we have kind of our standards for decision making are way too high. So that sounds like, do we all agree that this is the right thing to do? It's a normal framing of the prompt for making a decision. Do we all agree this is the right thing to do? Two problems there. One, do we all agree? That's not necessary. Is it the right thing to do? Probably we couldn't even know the answer to that if we tried. Like, that's too high of a standard. So what happens when you frame your decision-making that way is that people will deliberate because you've prompted them to deliberate. And they'll deliberate about nothing for the longest time. I started a company with 7 founders. And so don't do that. Number one, I was doing all the sales and I was drowning because we were doing really well. And we were closing about 50%, but it was taking an excruciatingly long time. And I was just drowning. And I needed a printer so that I could print out my sales reports, tape them to the wall, whatever. I needed a printer, just a $300, this is 23 years ago, $300 HP dumb printer. We debated for 6 months, 10 minutes every Tuesday at the partner meeting about whether to buy that stupid printer. And I'm not kidding. And that was a galvanizing moment for me. I was like, there's got to be a better way. Because I should have just gone out and bought the printer, but I thought I was being a good team player by letting it play out. But we said, is it the right thing to do to buy this printer? Do we all agree it's the right thing to do? And so we never made a decision. And part of the reason we never made a decision because it wasn't quite important enough to force. So we just wasted all of that time and money and attention. And more than that, our relationship suffered. Social capital was burned, right? Friction was created in the system needlessly. Okay, so that's one way that decisions go badly. Another way decisions go badly is that they're made very quickly. Have you ever been on a Zoom call and a decision's made and you can just watch people's faces and you're like, none of them are going to believe in that. They're just going to go off and do whatever the F they want anyway. And then, 2 weeks later, you're like, well, but I thought we decided X and everybody else is doing A, B, and C. And now you've not only wasted that opportunity for alignment, but you've now eroded trust. So now people won't trust that if they say they're going to do things, if they say they're going to go along with something, they will. And so what happens then is you create that's the seed of the culture that allows for pre-decision meetings. So now you've got meeting exponentially, right? So you have the pre-meeting meeting, right? Then you have side conversations, right? To create alignment before your pre-meeting. So you end up, when you sow those seeds of mistrust, you're creating the conditions where there's a culture of ambiguity and opacity, right? So what we want is to have rapid, simple, transparent conversations that move us forward. And instead, what you get is hidden, secret, mistrustful, it's almost like chaos, because nobody believes that when you have the meeting, you're actually going to be able to come up with a clear answer. So instead, both of those are about extremes. One, you make a decision too fast and nobody buys into it, believes it. The other, you make a decision too slow and you've just wasted all this time and effort. And so there's got to be something in the middle. And what I look for are two things. One, does this option clearly move us toward progress? Does this option help us move toward our outcome? And can we all live with it? Because, if someone says like, no, I actually can't live with it, it's insecure for this and that reason, it violates HIPAA, whatever, like, can we all live with it? Says like, is there a reason not to go this direction? So is it progress? And is there a reason not to do it? If you start there with your decision prompt, you're much more likely to get an open, transparent, easy conversation that moves you forward more quickly. So that's part of the faster, and that's also a lot less drama.
So we're moving away from, I could see it now, harder questions or high bar questions like, do we have consensus? Do we all agree? Is this the right thing to do? These are almost philosophical questions, and getting 100% alignment is not needed. And instead say, hey, are we chipping away? Are we moving forward in the direction we agreed on? And can we all live with it? Is there any glaring reason not to do this? And if you get those two check boxes, then
let's go.
I might be jumping to the end. That you're making a lot more decisions. A lot faster. And, kind of Jeff Bezos, I know he didn't invent this, but there's this type 1, type 2 decision framework that they used at Amazon. I really love that. I wish I could, if anybody knows who actually invented that, I would love to hear it. But this idea that you can make decisions quickly if they're easily reversed, if the impact of it being a wrong direction is nil, is minor. So I think that's what they call a type 1 decision. Type 2 decision is like, should we, do this merger or acquisition of this, $8 billion company from Brazil? Like, that's a decision that would be hard to undo. So you use more process on your type 2 decisions than your type 1 decisions. And I have some examples in the book about how to handle a deeper, more thoughtful decision that requires more process. You want to share a little bit about it?
I learned about it from one of the partners at Bain Consulting. And I call it the Bain decision-making model. And it is a 2-meeting solution. And the first meeting, you prepare for it. Somebody prepares for it, and it's a 1-page, summary of facts and alternatives. Here's the decision to be made. These are the salient facts. Here are the options available to us. And the purpose of meeting number 1 is to agree. This is the decision to make. These are the salient facts, and these are the options available to us. If you can agree on that, that's the whole point of meeting number 1. Then you take a week, 2 weeks. You do any research you need to in between times. You have your side conversations. You figure out and of what needs to be figured out in between times, you have a second meeting. And that second meeting is only half an hour, 45 minutes long. Doesn't have to be long. And that meeting is for decision and resourcing. So at the second meeting, the second meeting's purpose is not just decision, it's actually resourcing. And what that does is it creates durable commitment. So you have this framework that everyone in the decision process agrees to. It says, our first conversation is about these couple things. Our second conversation is about those couple things. And everyone shows up ready to do those things. I love this process. I've run it several times. It works like a charm.
Having the resourcing part of that makes it a prioritization question, not just, is this a good idea? Is it a good enough idea? Is it better than the other ideas that the same budget and the same constraints are drawing against?
And it creates lock-in. It creates actual, like, no, we are leaving this room committed. We have committed resources to this course of action.
Wow. As someone who has gotten a yes on something and then had to chase after the budget approvals for 3 months after that, I want to break things hearing this like amazing approach. Instead, that would have saved me those 3 months. I love it. So I personally have gotten to use a lot of your frameworks, not just with our clients, not just for running our business, but also at home. There was a summer party 2 years ago in this room, and a fun bunch of my friends from Toronto and Montreal and everywhere flew in a few nights prior. And the day of, as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'd left towards the end. And there was a Kanban board of sticky notes here. And everyone wanted to help, and I didn't think about it enough to organize the work. And I was surprised. About 5 minutes of writing some stickies of things that I had to do, put up there. And these are friends that I've known from college. So they have there's a decent amount of assumption they can make as well in terms of what I intended with some chicken scratch on a sticky note. So are there any stories that you can think of how folks use your frameworks outside of work or product?
Oh yeah, for sure. So one of my favorites is, so my daughter Gina is a software product manager who was also employed at Pivotal for a while, and her husband, she married another product person from Pivotal. So here we go. So a newlywed couple setting up housekeeping, right? 2 product managers who have been thoroughly trained in all of my methods. And so they were doing a reno on their house. And I actually included a sidebar in the book of this story. So Gina and Tim, their process is not just to do there's this tool they call the 2x2. It's like you sort a bunch of sticky notes according to 2 different sorted criteria, right? They now have a domestic work process that includes choosing what the 2x2 is. What are the dimensions what are the sorting criteria? So they have now institutionalized in their collaboration as a married couple. How do you decide what 2x2 you're going to use? What are your sorting criteria? So I don't know, maybe that doesn't play very well. Maybe you can't understand what it means. So I'll find another example. So during COVID, my son was a freshman in college, and he was on spring break the week that San Francisco went into lockdown. San Francisco was one of the very first places in the country to go into lockdown. And so here we are, spring break is ending. San Francisco has just gone into lockdown. No place else on the country has, right? So there's ambiguity in the system, and we had to make a decision. And obviously we're the parents, so it's up to us to make a decision about, do we send him back to campus or not? And there were radically differing opinions in the family. And so we leveraged the brains. We got everybody together. We did Post-it notes, pro-con, and we did a 2-way pro-con. So these are leverage the brains, orient honestly, value outcomes. So the first thing we had to do was decide what are the outcomes we're valuing. We wanted to keep everybody safe, but respect our son's autonomy as a human, right? So first we had the conversation about what are the outcomes. We stack ranked our outcomes, and we agreed on all of that as a family. And then we did a pro con around pro go back, con go back, and we did it 2 ways: pro stay home, con stay home. And what's amazing is how much different the information is when you flip your pro con and you prompt both ways, right? And then we prioritized. We're like, according to those 2 criteria: respect for his autonomy, safety of the family. And we ended up with a plan where he was allowed to go back, but that we would fly him home if certain specific things happened. And he ended up staying the semester and then did not go back in the fall. So it was a really difficult decision. This is the thing, there was absolutely no right answer. There was no way there was no way we would all agree, and there was no way to get to a right answer. And it actually mattered all the way. It mattered. It was life and death level of mattering. And so we were able to make a confident decision by getting input in a structured way from all participants. And, that could easily have turned into, my family's not prone to yelling, but it could easily have turned into a pretty bitter fight between all the different participants in my family.
Yeah, and certainly the first 2 of those criteria go hand in hand with any innovation, right? No one's going to agree. There isn't going to be an optimal solution that has certainty, or someone would have already done it and then there's nothing to agree about, and the certainty is being de-risked by the person who actually did the innovation. And then many of those cases, it turns out to being like highly meaningful if you're lucky to get to work on those things. So awesome. Thank you for sharing that personal story too. And so one of the things I love to ask my guests is what a recent product is or service that you got to experience or unbox, whether for work or at home, that just blew you away, where you said, hey, these folks get it.
Well, so it's interesting. The products that blow me away these days are not they're not innovative products. So okay. I was thinking about this, and honestly, the product that blew me away, I got from Mother's Day. I got a turntable, just an old fashioned, straight up record player, analog, vinyl. And I went out, I had to think a long time. Like, what's the first song I'm going to play? Right. What is it going to be? And I chose a song called Landslide by Fleetwood Mac from 1975. Which I didn't actually like when I was young. Right. There's something about that song that made sense for this year, for right now. And what was amazing was the user experience of choosing records, buying records, bringing them home, and playing them. And there's this real, I was not expecting it. I was unexpectedly delighted by the slowness of the choices. And it stands so in opposition to the Spotify experience, where you mindlessly are served as much music until you decide to turn it off. And if you play a playlist, then the algorithm just keeps shoving music at you. And there's something so different about the choice to take, whatever, is it 17 minutes? 17 minutes is not a very long time. This thing, 17 minutes, it's a warm sound, and there are physical gestures. And so as a, old school user experience designer, I had this completely blown away experience by my first day playing vinyl on a turntable.
And something to be said about a technology that hasn't been drastically changed for decades. Yeah. It still just brings that same level of delight compared to something that might have been invented a couple of months ago.
Well, and maybe even a different level of delight because it stands in such stark contrast to where we've come, and I had been feeling really just dissatisfied with the streaming music experience. Like it just... Yeah. And I kept thinking, maybe I'm just not a very good curator of my own music experience. And then I was like, no, what I want is something much more deliberate and mindful and choiceful and humanly editorial.
And this blurry line between creators and consumers of the music there, given just how automated even playlist making is becoming with the algorithms, deciding what record goes on, you're kind of closer to the folks playing the instrument than the folks listening to it, right?
I love streaming. I love the artist, creator, publisher, disintermediating the big companies. All that's fantastic. And it turns out that choosing a record at a record store, bringing it home and putting it on, that slow process has its own kind of warmth and appreciation.
Well, Janice, where can folks find you?
JaniceFraser.com is my URL. The book is Farther, Faster, and Far Less Drama. And on social, I'm really most active on LinkedIn at this point. So that's how you can find me.
Awesome. Definitely check the book out. I'm curious, are any of the videos from Luxor still available online somewhere, or where can folks kind of get the plus version of the book around facilitation techniques and stuff too?
I have some facilitation videos. I don't know that they're publicly available. Someday we'll do facilitation classes in an e-learning type format. I don't know. We've dabbled in it, but we haven't really done too much with it.
Fair enough. We will stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for making the time. I have loved learning from you from our time together at Pivotal facilitating workshops, actually back at Procter Gamble, coincidentally, and have gotten to use those techniques at work, at home, while building Integral. And it's a real honor for me to have you on here. Thank you so much.
Well, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be in your universe.
Hope y'all enjoyed that episode with Janice. Something that she mentioned that I don't think we gave enough credit to was the idea of a 2x2. It's something that I use even myself sometimes when I just need to get thoughts out of my brain and convert them into decisions. And it may come, somewhat in tandem with something called the OODA loop that I'm sure a lot of the folks working in Agile have heard. OODA loop stands for observe, orient, decide, act, spelling OODA, hence OODA loop. I believe it stemmed from the Air Force, where pilots would quickly need to observe what was around them, orient themselves and the observations, make decisions on that orientation, act, and then it's a loop because they go back to observing again after they've taken action, orienting again, making new decisions, taking the next set of actions. And as you can imagine, product teams that do best oftentimes do best at the OODA loop and are able to iterate a lot faster, right? I personally believe that one of the hardest parts or the most differentiating parts in the OODA loop is the orientation. It's where you apply a lot more subjectivity, and going wrong there can really make the downstream decisions and those actions way more risky. So a 2x2, I found, is one of the best ways to orient yourself and your team in a similar way based on the best tools that you have. And let's use a quick example, right? Say there's 4 of us, and for whatever reason, we need to collectively make a decision for catering an event. And we've all got our own favorite choices of caterers and different reasons for why we favor those caterers. And now, without leading with facilitation, chances are, and you've been in this conversation too, we would pick our favorite and we would try to convince everyone else of it. And the loudest person or the highest paid person usually ends up getting their way there. And that's not necessarily what's best for everyone that's making the decision, and especially not necessarily what's best for the people who are showing up to the event that's being catered for the audience that we serve, right? So if we were using the OODA loop, what we would do in terms of observing is looking at the various options and getting menus from them. And the menus will tell us what's on there, what they cost, etc. In order to orient and using, say, 2x2s, we have to figure out what the axes need to be, i.e., we need to figure out what's important to us in order based on which we will decide whether we made the right decision or not, whether this is the right choice we made for caterers. And let's keep it simple. Let's say we want food that tastes good, food that's healthy, and something that's not too expensive. So if we're going about making a 2x2, we have 3 factors. How do you do that? You could try making a 3-dimensional 3x3, or what I found to be way easier is to split these up. Janice will likely advise us to prioritize across these factors. And again, let's just say the first 2 most important out of these are the tastiest food and the healthiest food. And cost is the 3rd priority. So what we'll do is we'll do a 2x2. We'll draw a vertical line and a horizontal line. At the top of the vertical line, I'll say most tasty. At the bottom, we'll say least tasty. And on either side of the horizontal line, I'll say more healthy and less healthy. And then we'll take the options, look at the menus, and agree collectively as to where we would place the various options. And it's a lot easier if you do them one by one. Do the vertical one first and stack rank them there, and then horizontally stack rank them. And what you end up with, especially if you try and split up the options 50-50 across the lines, is you'll end up with a quadrant that shows you the tastiest and the healthiest options, right? So you've whittled down, say, maybe 10 or 12 catering options down to 3 or 4. And now we can have price being the determining factor between the final 3 or 4. And you do the same thing. You draw a vertical line and a horizontal line. And you got to rename the answers that came from the first one, the combination of tasty and healthy. And we can say most preferred and least preferred. And then on the other axis, you have most expensive or more expensive, less expensive. And then you plot those out again. And then you typically emerge with a much more whittled down set of options, at which point you can apply different techniques or other conversation where you're talking about just deciding between 2 versus deciding between 10 without having much of a framework. So I use 2x2s all the time, and so did the team at Integral with ourselves and with our clients. And it's just something that is easily overlooked despite how powerful it is. And there's a lot of real thinking that goes into what the axes should be, as well as determining where on the axes your various options for the decision will end up being. And I personally feel like those decisions are a big part of orienting the observations that you have as part of the broader OODA loop. So if you ever want any help or a soundboard with respect to preparing for facilitating a workshop, or you're feeling like you're not too sure if you're using the right axes as you're trying to use 2x2s, check out the product success labs that the folks at Integral offer, integral.io/convergence, and we will be happy to give you that soundboard. Thank you for listening, and watch for the next episode on Tuesday. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.